Hello, everyone. So we're going to have to learn how to pronounce his name. Roman Shogdzhiev, this young Russian player, only 10 years old, has just broken a record for precocity. He is the youngest international chess master in history at just 10 years old. Well, I invite you to discover one of his games, to understand his play, his style, his strategies. The game he played last year at the World Rapid Championship. Let's watch. He has white and starts with e4. His opponent replies with c5, the Sicilian defense. Knight to f3, knight to c6, and he develops quickly with bishop to b5. Of course, this prepares for kingside castling, but the possible bishop for knight exchange is fascinating because it can change the pieces and the pawn structure. And all the imbalances that are created lead to different strategies. This is going to be very interesting. Right away, the opponent plays g6, and we have this exchange. Without delay, bishop takes knight. So already we can ask ourselves, which pawn should recapture? Some people prefer to recapture with the b7 pawn to c6, to take towards the center, bringing a pawn closer to the center so that the c6 pawn controls the d5 square. But his opponent is going to recapture towards the outside. The pawn moves away from the center. Yet this is a fairly common strategy because it allows for quick development of the bishop and opens the file to the queen. And that light-squared bishop precisely is the only piece that white doesn't have now, because black has the pair of bishops, since there was that exchange of bishops for knights. So black must work to find play with their light-squared bishop. And indeed, the young Russian player plays h3. He's going to prevent the bishop from coming to g4. And in the end, if we look at the diagonals of that bishop, they're not very promising. Well, of course, it can settle on e6, but for what purpose? In the game, bishop to g7 was played d3, kf6. Kingside castling. And here comes a move that will surprise you. You might be expecting black to kingside castling. Well, no, it's knight to d7 that's played. Why does the knight retreat? It's fascinating. You have to understand that white doesn't have a light-squared bishop, so they should rather control the light squares. But above all, they need to fight for the dark squares. And white may be led to play this pawn push to e5. Or play rook e1 to protect the pawn of 4 and be brought to play this push in d4. And the idea of knight d7, it is precisely to double the control of the square e5, to prevent white from being able to play e5, to double the control of the square d4, and even to prepare the move e5 so that white cannot play d4. By the way, white plays king d3 and e5 is played. And you see, the d4 square is caught in a vice. There are 3 controls of this square. And the knight, as soon as it moves, the queen will also control, so it will hinder the d4 push of white. As for the knight d7, it can maneuver, and its ideal square is to join the square d4, especially with plans like knight f8, knight e6, then knight d4. So it's long, that's true, but I've already seen this plan come to fruition in master games, and even in grandmaster games. White plays f3, black plays b6, queen d2. And here, the young Russian player combines the queen with the bishop to go to h6 to take away the opponent's pair of bishops, and especially that precious bishop. If the opponent simply kingside castling, we can have bishop h6. So the opponent will play the pawn to h6 himself to prevent the bishop from coming. That will prevent the exchange of bishops, but it's a drawback. Now, the black king won't be able to castle. Otherwise, the rook will no longer be on h8, and white will be able to capture the pawn on h6. Nevertheless, white needs to find a plan for development. What plan can they come up with? So I invite you to pause the video. Careful, you're not looking for a tactical move here. There's no combination in this position. You need to look for a plan of development. How are we going to make progress in this position? Go ahead, you can pause the video. So what did you come up with? Let me remind you that with white, you need to fight for the dark squares since they don't have a light-squared bishop. So you need to look for the levers for development. In particular, the rooks are connected. They're just waiting for one thing, for the files to open up. What are the levers for development? There are 3, b4, d4, and f4. For now, none of these levers can be played. But the b4 lever can be played if you prepare it with a3. By the way, that's a plan that has often been played by other players. The d4 lever is still complicated. There are 3 pieces controlling that square, and when the knight moves, there will even be a 4th. On the other hand, the f4 lever is easily available. All it takes is for the knight to move. And look at this knight. For now, it doesn't have a square to go to. It's not doing much work. So it might as well move to let the pawn f2 come to f4, attack the e5 pawn, and create the conditions to open the f-file. As for the knight on h2, it can even jump to g4 to attack the h6 pawn. Black plays g5. And so black prevents the f4 lever. So what are we going to do now with white? Well, once again, I invite you to pause the video. It's not a combination. Again, it's a plan, an evolution of maneuvers. How are we going to exploit the position with white? So what are you thinking? If you thought of g3 to try to support f4, there's a flaw. The thing is, this push to g3 weakens the pawn on h3. And don't forget that the opponent has the white square bishop, and that bishop wants to attack h3. So there could be knight to f8, so the bishop can attack, and after king to g2, for example, queen to d7, and this threat on h3. So of course you can play g4, but now the knight can jump to g6 and look for the h4 square with check, or even the f4 square, because capturing would allow recapturing with the pawn and maybe open up the bishop. But already you can see that the f4 and h4 breaks will no longer be possible. So in this position, it wasn't g3 that was played, but knight e2. Why knight e2? In reality, the knight on c3 wasn't doing anything. It can't go to b5, it can't go to d5, e4. There's no point in protecting it. And a4, there would be no point in going to this off-center square. So the knight is going to take advantage of the move g5, which has weakened the f5 and h5 squares. Yes, it's true. White can no longer play the f4 pawn break. But on the other hand, they can exploit the weakness of this square. It's too deep in the opponent's position, and the knight on e2 is aiming to come to g3, then to f5 or h5. Knight f8, the opponent does the same with his knight towards g6. Knight g3, knight g6. You see, now it's a battle of maneuvers. But the knight can go to h5 and finds a target first before the black knight. So you could kingside castling to protect the bishop, but that would allow white to exchange this valuable bishop. And you know, the opponent really values his pair of bishops. Maybe a little too much, actually. And he plays bishop, f8. But as a result, the second knight arrives. Its threat coming into f6, bishop e7, but now the g7 square is no longer defended. Knight check, king f8, and knight f5 with double attacks on the h6 pawn. And you know, in case of h5, there could be knight takes, bishop, and the g5 pawn itself would become weak. That's why the opponent will finally decide to take the knight on f5. Pawn takes, knight h4 attacks the f5 pawn, but the e5 pawn can become a target. And you see, white are still quite well developed. The problem for black is that they don't have a completely safe shelter. However, black plays queen d5, and after all, they're threatening checkmate on g2. So this checkmate threat needs to be dealt with. And here, white has a perfect move. It's the f4 push, which allows the second rook to be freed so that the queen can defend the g2 pawn laterally. As for the f4 pawn, it also comes to defend the knight, which the black queen was also attacking, and to engage in the fight on g5 to try to open the f-file. Black takes on f5, rook e1, bishop f6. And here, the young Russian player plays a very nice move. He plays c4. So one might wonder why this move is actually so nice, why it is so important. You need to push back the queen and, if possible, arrange things so that she can no longer defend the knight and is forced to move. For example, to d6 or d8. Let me explain. In the game, the queen came to d6. If she had come to e6 to protect the knight, she would have been in the sights of the rook. And the bishop and the knight could escape very easily. For example, bishop takes c5 check, then you capture, and knight to g6 check, and the queen is lost. So now you understand that after this push to c4, if you look at the squares for the queen, in reality there is only the square d6 or the square d8. In the game, the queen came to d6. And why did the Russian player want the queen to be on d6? And that the knight not be protected by this queen? Well, it's to set up a combination. He's going to play knight, takes f7. He knew anyway that his knight on e5 would be targeted as soon as he takes on g5. So he sacrifices his knight on f7, king takes, and now he takes on g5. And so, as a result, this immediately allows the rook to attack the unprotected knight. The queen doesn't defend it, while also attacking the bishop and the king, who is in the line of fire behind. And this knight sacrifice, knight takes f7, was important because it attacked the queen. So black was forced to respond immediately to this attack. So king takes, pawn takes, and rook takes f5. White has a pawn more, but that's not what's important in the position. What is important is the fact that the black king is targeted and that the f-file is open. King g6, rook f1, rook f8, queen f2. Look at the pressure on the f column. Bishop e7. The bishop retreats, the rook on the f-file is well protected, but a nice move from the young Russian player. I suggest you try to find it yourself, by the way. What would you play in this position? What did you think of? He simply played bishop takes g5, thinking that if the bishop takes, he can catch the rook. And after rook takes, queen recaptures, and rook recaptures. He'll have 2 extra pawns. And the rook, which is superior to the bishop in this endgame. So after bishop takes g5, white are not afraid of bishop. Takes bishop, we said it loses the rook in f8. If black take the rook in f5, the queen retakes with check and the attack on the king continues. So black have the factor takes d3, with the idea that if white take the bishop on e7, they will lose the rook on f5 because the queen on d3 also allows for triple attacks on that rook. And here they play a move. Very subtle, very delicate, a little move, bishop f6. And that provokes the opponent's resignation. How does this little move provoke the opponent's resignation? Well, bishop f6 will intercept the rook's attack on the rook at f5. So as a result, the rook on f5 can't be taken. Now you might say, yes, but the bishop on f6 can be taken. For example, bishop takes. But we recapture, rook takes f6, check. And the attack is decisive against the black king. For example, rook takes, queen takes, check. Already we have 2 pawns up. No, we have 1 pawn up, but this majority of 4 pawns against 3 can't be used. Because they're double pawns, it can't create passed pawns in the endgame, whereas white has 2 connected passed pawns, which in an endgame, that is if the queens are exchanged, could help promote to a new queen. But here, we're not even talking about an endgame. We're talking about a checkmate attack against the black king. If he goes to h5, rook f5 is coming, and if he goes to h7, certainly. Queen f7, check. King h6, rook f6, check. So I don't know if I checkmate him the fastest, but the checkmate is certain. Queen g7. Check forces the king to come to h4 or h5. And on king h4, we would have queen g4 checkmate. And on king h5, we can take the rook h8, but we also have queen g4 checkmate. So the black king is far too exposed. So what I really liked about this young player's game is his keen understanding of imbalances. First, the bishop for knight exchange. He understood well that his opponent had the only light-squared bishop, and he would neutralize it with this move to h3 so that the bishop would have fewer prospects for play. I also really liked, in this position, his search for a lever when he plays knight to h2 to free the f-pawn so it can advance to f4. We saw in the game that opening the f-file was actually decisive. And when there's g5 to oppose f4, this maneuver, knight to e2, knight to g3, knight to f5, this maneuver, so that the knight reaches the f5 square and the other knight the g4 square, and provokes an infiltration into black's camp. And a little later in the game, we have this triumph on the f-file, this sacrifice on f7, which attacks the queen, king takes, and there is no shortage of targets. On the file pawn takes, he will recover his piece under very good conditions, still with the attack on the king. So what did you think of this young player? We'll be following his progress, of course, on the channel. You can leave me likes, comments, share the video, or support the channel. All right, goodbye everyone.